So let's do it. So uh, I've written a lot. That's all. Okay. My original proposal in the first version of my doctoral project was to explore some ideas developed during my master's degree, in which I focused on the issue of populism. In the master's project, the research revolved around the question, what stakes and why does it stakes when we're dealing with populist movements? Uh, the central hypothesis, I thought at the time, was the following: what the people emerging from populism demands is the place of legitimate representative of the nation, in virtue of which the state should exist. Populism, in this sense, would describe the political effort to convert popular power into sovereignty power. The relationship between democracy, people, state, and nation goes back at least to the age of revolutions, to use Eric Hobsbawm's terms. And I quote, the revolutionary, democratic, and nationalist these three concepts merge for him, not meet. The equation state, nation, people apply to both, but for nationalists, the creation of the political entities which would contain it derived from the prior existence of the revolutionary democratic point of view. The central concept was sovereign seats and people equals the state, which in relation to the remainder of the human race constituted a nation. Nor should we forget the I think this is the important how do you say trecho, gente?
Yeah, this part.
And the important part here. It seemed to me that this is not at all a new relationship between popular sovereignty, democracy, and the state, helped to explain why left-wing populism could find it in nationalism a kind of barrier, since populist logic, as taught by Ernesto Laclau, operates mainly within states, avoiding the national question or marking it as secondary. Since populist logic. Oh yeah, marking it as a secondary, something less important, makes it, I think, and that was the hypothesis, weak when confronted with right-wing populism. The people, when it emerges as a part that represents the whole, is confused with the nation, and the nation, in this case, does not necessarily coincide with the limits, constitutional, legal, bureaucratic, of the state. Often, as is common in populist movements, the people nation rises up against the state, which in these cases usually appears as a state of affairs, an establishment, an alien structure, alien to the interests of the real nation, and at the service of an enemy. So let's try to do some weird stuff here. So what I was thinking to do is to use to confront this populist logic with Karatani's theory. So what we have there was this idea that nation is an imagined community, and it comes from Benedict Anderson, based on reciprocal relation, and it brings about an imaginary form of communality that transcends the class conflict and contradictions caused by capitalist system. I will emphasize this aspect of Karatani's theory, that is the imaginary form, this solution that comes up in this imaginary form, not a. And I'm discuss this later. That what I'm thinking, it's a way it's a possible way to escape this trap, I think. So I think this, and in if you look to this system by the populist perspective, we can see that what we have here is when you have a moment of crisis in capital, a nation tries to pressure the state to respond to the crisis, and basically that's how nationalist discourse appears, usually trying to bring up this imaginary solution to a problem posed by capital. And this, I think what messes up this scheme is that we have another dimension that let me read this because it's a kind of new stuff here. The challenges posed by capital are not imaginary. They are abstract. They are too complex. They're too difficult to grasp. But they do not exist only at the level of the imaginary. They concern some kind of big order that we are not able to deal with effectively in the realm of imaginary. It does not fit in the national imagination. And here I go again, and I'm gonna take some some things Karatani said about that. The first one is this relation with religion. I remember, Gabriel, when in the original project, you suggest me to avoid this religion question, but I think it's unavoidable, and I gotta try to say why. So you have this structure in this imaginary community, imagined community present in universal religions and religions as usual too. Less universal, but we can think about it. Universal religions promised immortality to individual souls, but could not restore the communal temporality that was accomplished, at least in imagined form, by the nation. The people of nation accordingly include not only the living, but also its past and future members. This is why nationalism are characterized by attachments to both past and future. Anderson views the nation as a substitute for religion, and I think this is important. But this cannot explain the phenomena of religious nationalism, for example, or nationalism in India. But if we understand the nation as a substitute for community, then we see that what appears to be religious nationalism is in fact imaginary restoration of the vanished community. This is an aspect that I think is important for thinking about organizations. I'll try to, at the last, when I'm gonna raise some questions at the end of the presentation, and some of them goes directly to this point, that it is, how do we think this in the context of organization? But let's wait a bit. From here, we have this important stuff that we have. I said that we have this problem in the populism and left populism that we try to avoid to avoid became nationalists when we were left, this recently. But it was not always like that, and it's not always like that in every leftist movement that takes this populist form, I think. But actually, if you look to recent movements like Brexit, like Trump's election or Bolsonaro's election, I think this national question was with the right wingers. But it was not always like that. In movements in South national liberation directed against colonial rule, for example, socialists often fuses with nationalism. And Karatani has an explanation for that. This is because the capital is colonized in colonized countries is comprador or dependent capital, meaning that only socialists are prepared to pursue nationalism. As a result, socialism and nationalism are sometimes unavoidably equated in such situations. But it's not like that in other contexts. Let's see. It really becomes a problem elsewhere when nationalism takes on the guise of socialism in developed industrial capitalist states. This is what we call fascism. Fascism is national socialism, as we see in the official name of Nazi party or whatever, whatever. It is, in other words, an attempt to transcend capital and the state through the nation. It's hostile to both capitalism and Marxism, but is impossible to supersede capitalism and state through nation. That is, it's an important aspect. National socialism created an imaginary community that appeared to transcend capital and state. The powerful attraction that held fast in fascism in many countries arose from the vision it offered of a dream world, really a nightmare world, in which all contradictions were overcome and in the here and now. Why I'm focusing on this aspect? Because I think what I have today is this aspect of imaginary solution that really doesn't solve anything. Is what is in what is at stake in this right-wing nationalism today? Because when you look at Trump or Bolsonaro or whatever, you see that we can't deal with national economies as you could deal in the beginning of the nation states. It's very hard to control an economy, to be a protectionist without suffering some kind of consequences of the world markets, from the world markets. And I think when you see this promise sovereignty, it's just a promise, because you can't deal with that in practice, because you are integrated in a big economy. That's why I use this thing to to try to express it, because I always even when you try to this imaginary solution, what you goes from the state, you can eventually take the state, you win an election wherever. But when you try to deal with mode C, with capital, what you have is you're dealing with the whole world that is in operating that logic. So it's only imaginary at this sense, I think. Let me see. Well, the collapse of Marxist movements in the face of fascism is in so many places came about because they regarded the nation as merely a superstructure. All that discussion and Marxism. Ernst Bloch, confronting the reality of Marxist impotence in the face of Nazism, argued that unlike Marxism, Nazism was able to summon up and mobilize various elements from the past, and that that had been repressed under capitalist rationality. This means that Nazism was able to make use of the nation as the imaginary return of mode of exchange A. This seems to promise socialism. In other words, mode exchange. Also, let's forget about D. That's a politic of the group. And I have this question. The most part of this are in this associationism chapter and structure of world history. So This also helps to explain why and so many anarchists were won over the fascism. Italy's fascists, for example, were under the influence of the anarchist theorist George Sorel. And that's an influence of that's a theory that Lacan uses to end his theory. So there's something in it. Benito Mussolini was the original leader of the Socialist Party, breaking with it only after its initial opposition to participation in the First World War. Even then, he did not abandon the cause of rebelling against capital and state. In his view, capital and the state were to be superseded by the nation. In this sense, Italian fascism was really a corrupted form of anarchism. In the same sense, the nation is an imagined community. In the nation, the real disparities produced by capitalist economy and the lack of freedom and equality are compensated for and resolved in imagined form. Uh, Moreover, the nation involves the imagination of a community based in reciprocity, and that is distinct from the ruling apparatus of the state, where nation is not the same like state. At the same time, however, as the imagined solution to contradictions generated by capital state, the nation also shields the capital state from collapse. Or say, let's say, when you came that into that framework, you kind of became trapped. In that because you run in circles, like literally. If you look at the circles scans of Karatani. Um, so I think that for me was the problem with left populism all the way. Um, so we have this reading from 18 Brumaire that I like a lot because I think we can see this dynamic more clearly. This synthesis was affected by Napoleon Bonaparte, a military leader who won popularity through his role in the wars and the French Revolution. There were hardly revolutionary wars, though. Their real impact was to defend and expand the nation. Napoleon metamorphosed the fraternity of the French Revolution into a nationalist that could resist British capital. So we see that dynamic here. In this way, the freedom, equality, and fraternity of the French Revolution were synthesized by the Borromean knot of capital nation state. Napoleon went from being president to emperor by projecting the illusion that he has the fulfillment, that he was the fulfillment of the demands of all classes. And the Second French Revolution in 1848, Louis Bonaparte engaged in a repetition of his uncle's performance and became emperor. This is the theory of history repetition from Caratani. Yet Louis Bonaparte was in no sense an exceptional figure. He was merely a prototype of the kind of charismatic politician who would subsequently appear everywhere whenever capital nation state fell into crisis. So here we got this motherfucking skin. In Karatani has this graphic to pencil ótimo to describe this movement. He equates a nation with imagination, understanding with state, and sensibility with capital. I know Gabriel hates this thing, but Lacan, I think, doesn't hate that much. So what? So what he does is I think it's just like this. For him, populism is like the imaginary synthesis of that for Karatani is a nation. Institutions are like this. Is it's like the symbolic of the, it's the way you translate the demands of the people into some kind of structure. And capital is basically it appears only in moments of crisis. Like it when you can see this abstract structure uh, uh, pressuring the institutions and pressing communities. Uh, so I think really think for Laclau, what you have is this: populism is this imaginary dimension. Uh, Institutions are the symbolic, and the crisis is the real. When you have a rupture that put all this in crisis, and you have to rearrange. But you have this circular movement all the way. You got a crisis, you got a new imaginary solution, you reform institutions, and so it goes. The problem for me is that what you have is what you have is a politics that is closed in the nation framework. And when you try to address some systemic problems, you got these limitations, and I think this is really an issue. So, some questions. Today, I have this four, at least, questions that haunts me. How to deal with the challenges imposed by capital without going through the imaginary solution of nationalism. And I don't know, and if you have to go through imagine a community as a political organization complexifies, grows in scale, how can you not fall into the frame of the nation or religion, or even how to pass through either or both of them without getting stuck? Can we think of a path to communism that, instead of passing through nation, passes through a process of communation? And this is almost a joke that I'm using to think. So that's it. I told you it was not a big deal, and I have basically questions. I think some of them are interesting for our last discussion. For example, this aspect of when you gain in complexity, I really think the organizational community, as you say, it sometimes depends on some kind of imagined dimension to sustain some kind of unity that makes people that maintains people together. And I think really that some of these problems that are present in the nation discussion, all this old discussion about nation, they're present in this organization level today, even if that creating a new state or separatist movements are not something really real today. I was thinking about Jackson and the article I've written to the Atlas, and what I think is interesting there is that this nationalistic imaginary, the idea of creating an independent nation, was present at the beginning of the activist biography, but in Jackson it was it was kind of another dimension, to another level, to use Karatani's words. But I have some doubts about what to do when you grows in scale. Fun fact that's that they use in Jackson this example of Mondragon cooperative corporation. I don't know. But the cooperative of dos Países Bascos, gente, não vou lembrar como é que traduz isso. Tá, whatever. In Spain, whatever.
Yeah, in Spain, yeah, around Spain.
Yeah, é porque os Países Baixos têm essa coisa de uma tradição eu estava vendo no Hobsbawm da tradução de uma tradição de direita, na verdade, de nacionalismo de direita, mas se puder traduzir.
I don't know how you say this, the Basque region.
Basque, yeah.
The Basque region, yeah, they have a tradition of a right-wing nationalism, in fact, right?
Yeah. That's it.
The Mondragon cooperative.
So people, that's it. That's what I got today. I have a lot of more questions and things, but what I could organize, if you can call it organized, but was that. So please ask me things and curse me. I don't know.
Let's take our 5-minute break before we go into the debate. So
okay.
Are we back?
Yep. Since we're on the Mondragon, can you go back to the connection you were talking about with the Jackson, Mississippi people? You said they were taking some influence or something from it. What was
Influential with what? Sorry?
just the relation between the Jackson, Mississippi and Mondragon that you were mentioning at the end. Can you just talk about that again?
All right.
Yeah.
Because they did this cooperative model that they developed or are developing there was inspired by Mondragon Corporation model. And the only relation I did was because I was reading this Nationalism from Eric Hobsbawm today, and he says that the nationalist movement in Basque Country was mostly a right-wing movement, but I'm not saying that Mondragon is the case, but I think it's something to
Do you think there's a relation in the sense of like some stronger sense of like national unity that allowed that experiment to take place in the first place? That it's also a place that is like, you know, ready for ultranationalism because for the same reasons, like a common cause essentially, rather than like anything else. If that makes sense.
I think that is the ambiguous dimension that, like to use a Caratanist word, of nationalism. That I think this unity you get when you have this kind of movement. I think it permits you to promote some kinds of association that don't it's harder to sustain and in another kind of arrangement. And this is this is a question is important for me today, that how you can get this kind of something similar to that, but that doesn't fall into the same traps and trap in that sense too, that that you became isolated in this national the nation framework, you know, because you know when you think about class struggle, you have this, if you have to deal with the system as a whole, you have to go beyond that framework, and I think this is a fucking problem. So, John, Gabriel, who?
I think John's first.
Well, first off, Michael, that was a great presentation. I really like, because I feel like in the last month we've kind of had some really good kind of looser form meetings, and I really think this is a good model of that. I really liked the way you brought up texts and the highlighting and stuff. Like it made it very kind of easy to like kind of get into the meats of it. I'll probably steal that idea for my own presentation, but I like the color coding and stuff. It was really nice. And I think it's like I know because we come from these like really big technical meetings, these kind of seem like, oh, so much less. But honestly, like I think formulating questions nicely, I think your questions are excellent. The ending points are really good. Like I think especially where we're at as an organization right now, it's really good. It lets us kind of take these really abstract things and move in some really concrete dimensions. So I really appreciate it. And thank you on that.
Great.
Like I said, Hobsbawm and his mentor Ernest Gilner were like major things early on in my research. And a lot of it came down to like the studies of civil war. The first one was like the Russo-Chechen War and Chechen nationalism. And then later Kurdish nationalism. Actually, I got into a little bit the Basques and Mondragon at one point, and a few other places. So in the context of everything we've developed here over the last couple years since reading Karatani's book and starting to get into this, my main question, I guess, is if you go back to Gilner, I know Hobsbawm makes it more nuanced, but I feel like he's ultimately based on Gilner in the sense, and Karatani, I think, quotes Gilner's description in the book, which is nationalism comes from two main things for him. One, the kind of alienation, lost community of industrial society, which we can call capitalism, but he's like a weird liberal, so he calls it industrial society instead. And then like the actual kind of Machiavellian machinations of the state, right? Like they're kind of using nationalism in their geopolitics. And those are the two kind of historical causes that then this imaginary community comes around for Gilner. And then, Hobsbawm, I think, then takes and kind of puts it in a more imperialist colonial history, but still, I think, ultimately relies on that. And I think Karatani also in his analysis, in part because he wants to romanticize Mode in a way that we don't want to, wants to recover something that's there and at the same time make all the bad stuff go away, which I think he does by like hinging really heavily on the imaginary per se, right? Because then you can make Mode really nice and all the bad things just come from this like imagination. But I think when we look at the logic of Mode, the actual mechanisms of it that Tiago and Gabriel have mapped out, like there's something real there that we can't get around, that we have to actually address, that nationalism does deal with, right? There is a logic of gift and exchange, of loyalty and demonstrations of loyalty that you really see come out, like, here in the States with Trump, with Bolsonarismo, with Erdogan in Turkey. There's a whole, not just nationalism, but real economy of kinship or network of kinship or something that emerges that is real in a sense. And I think when you look for, like, to go a little bit more into the Basque example, right? Like the Mondragon developed in the post-war period under the thumb of Franco's anti-Basque exterminationist policies, right? So like, it's not just like it became right-wing in the same way the Ukrainian movement is right-wing, in the same way half of Kurdish nationalism is right-wing. It's not all for the Kurdish Workers' Party, blah, 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 which itself is a very politically weird entity, right? But like, these networks do form a lot of times under very real conditions of oppression and like one kind of domination over another. And I think that like, and part of the genius, but also really part of the dangerous legacy of like the Leninist tradition is like giving just so much gunpowder to those movements and being like, go national liberation, go. And it's had a lot of weird effects. But I think like I feel like there's something to cash out in trying to like maintain, because I agree, like there's something very imaginary about national communities that we have to critique and push against. But I think like, and I like this idea of the communation, like it's a good joke, like I'm gonna stick with it in my head too, because I think there's something in this kind of logic that Gabriel and Tiago have really been mapping out. And we're starting to kind of explore how the three fit together, that I think we do have to speak to, and that we can't push away by saying it's all the bad stuff is imaginary. Like, I think there's a very real danger of power and a kind of like, for lack of a better word, cliquishness that's imminent to Mode. That's not something like I think we've probably all dealt with in the left one way or another. Let's just put it that way. So I'll just say, but like, I think I like the questions, and I think those are precisely the questions to ask. I'm just curious, like how we parse out this difference between imaginary as such and the kind of like logics that we're kind of exploring. So thank you very much, and this was excellent.
Nice, great. Yeah. I think we're at the same page here with a lot of problems to think about, but yeah, I think this is I don't like to demonize how to this dimension of the imaginary, just like it was like just let's take out the imaginary, and everything is solved. I don't think that. That's my point. I think that is some logic there that we have to apprehend some way. I think it appears in religion too. That's my point. And when you look at religious movements in Brazil, you can see that. I see that logic operating crime organizations, like we talk about PCC last week. And so what is happening there really, and why we can, and what we can learn from that to leftist organizations? That's it. Gabriel?
Yeah, no, I think your presentation clarified a lot of things for me. And the thing that John mentioned, I think it's really, really, really central. This thing that, I mean, I never stopped to think about this, but now I think it's very important. When Benedict Anderson says, nations are imagined communities, the effective word there is the imagined. That's a special case. That's not how communities are normally. That's like a pathological community.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing I realized is that there is actually three things that are different, and that I think usually these different analysis, they put all of them in the same bag. And I think you're starting to distinguish them, which is populism, nationalism. There's something essentially different about them. That's why they actually can clash. And leftist populists can be afraid of becoming nationalism, right? But neither of the two is really community building. And there is a mistake, but Benedict Anderson is adding the imaginary in front of community to qualify that nation is a particular type of community. So if you allow me the excess, if Rafael could just share give me co-hosting privileges. I just wanted to draw something. Rafa, would you mind? I'm not sure if it worked. Okay. It's just this, because what John was referencing is that looking into anthropology, currently what Thiago and I are trying to show is that the logic of reciprocity, it's not like, usually when we think about communities, we think like this, right? There are people here. And then we're gonna say like they are together, right? And there are some people who are outside of the community. So it would be a logic of the inside and the outside, right? What we realized is that if you want to have one concept of community that is valid for like Amerindian tribes, Australian clans, Chinese clans or whatever, all the way to contemporary community forming, you need a logic that has three positions and not two. It needs to have an inside, an outside, and an indeterminate point. Like for nerds, the point is that something Yasha clarified for me is that the logic we thought has to do with reciprocity is a logic of closed sets, meaning this is a closed set. This is a closed set, meaning they share this boundary point, which is neither inside nor outside, which is something in psychoanalysis is always dealing with, right? Like you separate the inside, there's something outside, but then the question is, what about the frontier? Is it inside or outside? Who does it belong to, right? So we realize that you can only explain gift giving, animism, totemism, why women are exchanged in most societies, and blah, 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 all those things, if you have these three values. You need to say what is inside. This separates you from the outside, and you need to do something about the frontier. It's not solved. Like, then you need to create a new insight that includes this here, and then you create a new problem, and then you say that all of this is like, it creates all this problematic, right? So why am I saying this? Because this helps us to show something, which is community logic. To create communities, not imaginary communities, regular community, you need to have insides, outsides, and you need to do something about the boundary, the frontier, right? I'm just going to write boundary here, the point in between, right? When you look at the nation logic, because nations are not communities that are built on the void, they are built on top of state and capital. So there's already the state citizen, and there's already the owner of labor power, who is an individual, right? There's a lot of structure. It's not like people meet in the middle of a jungle and they say, let's form a nation. It's built on top of other things. So nations only have insides and outsides. It's not meant, the frontier is meant to be solved. The state solves the problem of the frontier, right? The boundary, the state says, no, international politics solves that. There is no problem. The boundary is ours, or the boundary is from the other. It disappears, right? And what I find nice is to realize that populism like, what is the concept that is, so the concept that is holding the nation together is something like people belong to a territory. People belong to this land. People are all of the same bloodline or whatever, right? But there's nothing behind populism. Populism doesn't have one trait to unite everyone. You create the trait, right? So it's only the boundary. So you see the three values of building community is split. Nations only have inside and outside, and populism only has the boundary. So then you understand why one thing threatens the other. They're like complementary, right? So the people is like, it doesn't have an ethnical background, it doesn't have a bloodline, it doesn't have anything concrete to hold it together, right? It's purely indeterminate. You can build it as you want. While nations are very determined, like they have a limit that is based on, you know, ethnic or history or whatever, but they are kind of like, this is us, those are them, right? And populism is just indeterminate, but communities usually include the three things. So you can actually, with this distinction, you can put all your hope in community and not be sure you're not confusing it like with nation and populism, because they are logically different, right? And I think this becomes clear when we add the other dimension we've been studying. So this is the logic, right? And the other dimension we've been studying is the material, because what we realized is that you can't really explain how communities are built, like in most societies, especially pre-modern societies. They cannot be built by people meeting. Like, you arrive in the middle of the jungle, I've never seen you before. How do I know if you're an enemy or not, if we're gonna make, you know, good contact or not? What happens is that communities use aspects of the natural world to propagate their own logic. So if you're an Amerindian society that builds logic in terms of encounters in the forest, where you don't know who is the prey, who is the predator, you use the fact that nature has prey and predators to propagate, like to kind of trust that you can read everything that happens in that way. Or, for example, we trust that marrying people together, then having kids, hereditary traits of genetics will pass along the logic to the kids. So if me and my wife are in the same family and we have a kid, the kid is in the same family. So it propagates the family, right? It propagates the logic of community through physics, physiology, material things, right? You can do it with other things. It doesn't need to be genes. Like people who have a certain object are part of the same group. People who dress the same shirt are part of the same group. That's material, right? And so you have, like, say, things that are material that help you take this logic beyond what people can directly do. Let's say, I don't know everyone who cheers for Flamengo, but the t-shirt, the object, guarantees that whoever uses this t-shirt is part of the same group, right? So the whole point is that you can show that the material traits that form communities can be very, very, very distinct. But the material traits that form nations are very, very poor, because they're like ethnical lines, color of skin, accent, the place where your mother, the hospital your mother had you. You're from one community or another, depending on, where the birth happened. Like, it's very stupid. Because it's already constrained by the state and capital, that it needs to be very simple. So you have like a poorer material trait, right? It sticks, but it still has something to stick, but it's less possibilities than community in general. Like, I can build communities using t-shirts. I can build communities by singing the same song. I can build community using whatever I want to propagate that community. But nations, because they're restricted and they need to respect other logics, they are very poor. They can only build communities and propagate communities with specific materials, right? And populism cannot propagate with any material, only with an idea, right? Or a signifier. So, like, the question you ask, why does it stick? Or it makes total sense when you look from this perspective here of the material reality that has the same form as the logic you're propagating, right? And I think that, it's no wonder that Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, they felt like trying to say we're going to move beyond nation to internationalism was still a problem, because they're still saying that there are like the inside, the outside, and then we're just going to create like a bigger inside with many insides inside of it, like many nations, right? And he said, this is not going to work. You need intercommunitarianism, right? So he wanted to move from this to this. So I think that the Black Panthers had a good idea that, like, community logic is not nation logic. Like, probably we should start treating nation as again, it's an imaginary, it's like a cheap version of community building, right? Yeah, so yeah, I think that's what Thiago and I were doing that John mentioned. I just went there just so we can, like, have a clearer vision of the distinction,
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have some two comments because I have to leave, but just wanted to. It's mostly adding questions to the discussion, and I think one of them. I think this discussion helps a lot to start to, because in my head I always had the question of what this mode, like this mode appears in many different like clothes, right? As nation, as identities, as community, as religion, and trying to track down or ground them, like Gabriel said, like the sort of like scale and sort of material basis of each one of those terms across sort of organizations and scales. I think is very helpful, and trying to think it also in a productive way, right? Because it's normally left out. The moment that this sort of more abstract version of community appears is probably because something went wrong, right? And so yeah, that's one thing. I think it's very interesting to sort of like track across scales and contexts the ways that mode appear. Then the second thing, with this last comment of Gabriel, it made much clearer to me like a sort of discomfort I always had with sort of populist theories, which I think they normally confound, because normally like the recent populist movements appear as a sort of like street demonstration moment in which these people, this sort of community really appears, and the sort of like anonymous encounter in the streets, in the squares. And normally you have a second moment, which is the sort of like institutionalization of it. But we tend to call it the whole thing as populism, right? The populist movement. But there's a very important change of material basis between these two times, right? And I think that this idea of populism as a boundary is interesting because it's exactly that seems to happen, right? You have this sort of people that emerges in the street, the sort of this envelope of the street, and it's sort of like it's moved towards the state, but its content it's missing. Then it becomes just a reference to say like the party becomes it has this sort of representative relationship. It's not more a sort of like embodied relationship. It points to this sort of interior which is not present anymore, which was the streets. So I think it's very helpful to keep in mind this sort of like what is the material basis, the vehicle of this communitary logic, because then you can distinguish between different kind of populisms, like a really popular populism and what I think Gabriel calls it passive populism, right? In which this sort of original popular base is not anymore present. And this a bit ties to my last comment, which is I was talking this with Michael, which is probably a good place to sort of like investigate is if we take like the peripherization thesis serious, is like how is the mode sort of like appearing today in Brazil, in which we have like this new reconfiguration of the way that the peripheries, all the thing about like PCC and the many regimes and how like money sort of like bonds in the way the community used to bond. So I think looking at how that appears. So to me, it's a bit like this sort of like vulgar nationalism, like is Bolsonaro some sort of that already? And because that, I mean, and just to tie to the comment about populism, because that realization about this lack of this material sort of like support that we used to. So, for example, the Workers' Party, the whole construction was a popular construction. It was some sort of like identity that was built into like some sort of like more material version of a people. While after 2013, even like the autonomous movements were realizing that there wasn't the notion of base, for example, wasn't lost traction already in sort of like the protests were mobilized, but they weren't mobilized in the old way that sort of like unions and social movements were able to mobilize them. So I mean, this goes a bit away straight from the discussion, but I think it's sort of related, trying to understand also what's the contemporary form in which nation and community appears. Like, I think it's a very, very interesting question. And I think, yeah, being able to sort of like track down the way the different forms, like what it makes into religion, like the evangelicals of Brazil, and when does it become an identity, when, and I think a really good path is this one, like of tracking this last comment of Gabriel, trying to find what's the vehicle of these communities.
Just to complete the since Renzo is also leaving, just this point, like, a really good way of seeing the difference between populism and community building is, I mean, we know that communities have to do with reciprocity, gift giving, and so on. And one of the characteristics that most Mauss studies is that reciprocity creates an obligation, right, between people. It's the annoying part, right? nobody likes this, but if you receive a gift, now you need to give a gift back. Like it creates a strange obligation. And I think it's a really good way of seeing the difference between imagined communities and communities, which is communities, you create an obligation to other people. In imaginary communities, you create an obligation to a fantasy, not to a person, right? You can be a nationalistic, like conservative Bolsonaro fan in Brazil, and you don't feel like you owe anything to anyone, right? It's totally different. Like the obligation becomes a compulsion with a fantasy kind of space, not with other people, right? So it's a good way of seeing the difference. Populism has a bit of that as well. Like you don't have an obligation to any real person, perhaps except voting for Lula.
I have something to say about that. I think when you look at religion movements, and I think it also helps to explain why Bolsonarism sticks, and why that nationalism maybe wasn't that important beyond the discourse. It's because they have they have practical things, they material things. They help people, they give you food, they give you a suit to feel important. You dress in a new way. There are really real things that people get from to build this community. It's not just a symbolic or imaginary attachment, and sometimes things got a little bit confused, because we tend to look at when you take this populist approach, you tend to look at it like just well, they have this discourse, and they are all believing this thing, this Brazil above all, and it's not just that. And I think this material part is really important. And sometimes we tend to, when you look at, especially when you look at electoral politics, we tend to focus excessively on this symbolic aspect, this imaginary dimension, So that's it.
Yeah, I think what I was going to...
Rafael?
Yes, I think what I was going to say is somehow related to what people were already discussing here. My impression is that something really cleared in your presentation, which is exactly what people have been stressing, in a sense that, and I think now that I see your description, I think it's a really lacking point in Karatani's analysis, because he focuses so much on the imagined communities that we don't get a real picture of what communities are like in the capital state nation triad. And that is actually, I think if we can take into account all these recent discussions on, not only on the peripherization thesis, but I think that there's also that book by that French sociologist about the dismantling of the French middle class, and all these, which is Guilly, something like that.
Guilly.
And yeah, and so I think that I have two things that I was thinking. The first one is connected to one of the questions that you had at the end, which was like, was it something like, do we have to pass through the nation? And if we do, how can we not be completely taken over by it or by populism? And in a sense, I do think that the key in your project is trying to understand this distance between this imaginative aspect and the real community aspect. And this is going to sound this is like, I always have these moments that like the last thing I read is the most important thing I have ever read. So I will do this. And for you people, thank God it's not Plato, but I was reading Badiou's Metapolitics, and which I even said that you should read it. Now I can explain why. I didn't know it then, but now I know why I recommended it to you. Like I went from the future to the past somehow. But he discusses in the end something that he's trying to do, something that he does because he has an essay on love where he mathematizes what love is. It's really interesting. There are probably limited, but it's an interesting exercise. And he does the same in regards to politics, where he says something like, a political process is a process where you have one infinity of possibilities, which is in a certain set. And then the state, in his jargon, it is like it's a part of the set, but for some mathematical reasons that I do not understand, there's an excess in the ways you can partition or represent a set. There are more ways, I think, to represent a set than the elements in the set. So that is the state power. And he says that the state power comes not from this majority, this numerical advantage, but from the fact that from the start, this distance is not visible. So the political process is a process that in the first moment, it makes visible, he'll say that it's the political prescription makes this distance numerically visible. And you can, in a sense, measure, when you are able to measure yourself up to the state. That is what a political process is. So what I was thinking is that, in a sense, nationalism, in its imaginative sense, seems like this obscure distance, because it's not a real community, but it does give the impression of being powerful and etc. And when you see political movements that, like like the Black Panthers, we can take stuff from Brazil. I mean, we could go wild here and say that the Brazilian Revolution, for those who don't know, this is like a tradition in the communist left in Brazil that faded away after the dictatorship, but it's making a comeback somehow. It seems to be an attempt to distance this obscure nationalism that I think is employed by right-wingers and people who are in power, but it seems in a sense to try and politically measure up the distance between this obscure nationalism and a community that could be material. I don't know. I'm just stating this because I do think that you have. This is something I think that is very hard and very important, because I mean, nobody wants to deal with questions of nationalism because that's for right-wingers. And I mean, who wants to do that? But if you take into account that this is a real issue that actually does muddle the waters, and I think that's the point. National questions muddle the political playing field, because you get people who are like, you know, there's this stupid discussion in Brazil, like, should I be proud of the Brazilian national soccer team? Because that's a symbol that has been reappropriated by the president. And like, that's such bullshit, because I mean, but I think that's an example of this obscuring power, because it's just like, when you get to the gist of it, it's just a football team, even if there are right-wingers on the team, etc. So I do think that I think that this is a good path that makes a lot of sense, and that maybe allows you to connect your two main interests, which seem like unconnected. I mean, they seem superficially connected at the first moment, like there are all these uprisings. I mean, at least for me, now it's connected. I don't know if it was connected before, but now it seems to me more connected. There are all these uprisings in Brazil, in the United States, etc., that are dealing with these nationalist issues. But there's also your other field of interest, which is the nationwide nationalism, which is abstract nationalism. And I think in a sense that the key to connect is something that, in a sense, and this is another moment where I'm going to say something that I just read, because Badiou also discusses what he calls a Thermidorian. I mean, French people will always do French stuff and take French symbols and universalize them. But it's very interesting where he's talking about what does it mean when ex-Maoist, and I mean, we have this a lot in Brazil. What does it mean when someone that was from the Workers' Party for 20 years, and then he suddenly becomes a right-winger that is a defender of order in the liberal state? I mean, what the hell is that? And then Badiou says that there is an attempt to disconnect the meaning in those practices that pre-existed. For example, and his example is the Maoists. He says that well, the Maoists in France, they are I think they're dedicated to the virtue of the people, and that's why they will go to the factories and talk with the immigrants. Look how good are these French noble people. And but the right-wingers, like the ex-Maoists, they will go on and say, look, this is just these guys are just Stalinists. They will literally kill people, even if they were not involved in any gulags, and even if there was a connection that made sense in that moment. So Badiou says that this conservative movement is a dismantling of names, of you take something that made sense, for example, in the French Revolution, terror was connected to virtue, violence was connected to virtue. Only when the search for virtue is over can you take away and say that the French Revolution was bad, because it's terror for terror itself. There's no meaningful practice. And in a sense, it seems that what you are doing is, it seems that it's the other way around, because you are recoupling what was, in a sense, it doesn't matter when it was uncoupled, but what I get is that you are reconnecting nationalism, even if it's been uncoupled from its, I mean, to the left, I'm talking from the leftist point of view. From the leftist point of view, nationalism has been uncoupled from any meaningful struggle. And you are connecting, you are reconnecting the virtue of nationalism, in a sense. Not as if nationalism is something in itself, but as something that, in a sense, connects, it's like you're trying to do the way from imagined communities to real communities, which I think is the communitarian, communation stuff you were talking about in the end. So, I mean, I think this really allowed me to, if this doesn't make sense, please tell me, because I'm very, I mean, it's I might read an essay tomorrow and then think otherwise, but at least for today, it seems to make sense. So, because it seems that you're doing, and I think it's even more important, I think, what you're doing.
Nice. I think that's great. Gabriel can talk more about Badiou. That's not my thing today. Maybe in the future, but yeah. I think what I'm trying to do, this thing with combination goes. I think it goes exactly this way. I don't know exactly how, but this came from Gabriel. It was really great. I took notes here, and I'm gonna put it on the project, and let's see. Yeah, Asha.
John, if you want to go first, you can go
No,
ahead.
I'm still thinking. And
Okay. Yeah, I have a few things that actually kind of connect with like a few little things here and there. We'll see if it makes any sense. The first thing that came to mind with this original nationalist imagined community idea is that when a nationalism claims to transcend state and capital, it's like, I think we often think of like transcendence as like maybe some kind of like inclusion of them both, but you can just as easily think of transcendence as like a ignoring of them, right? As like a almost like making like you not be able to tell the difference. And I think when Gabriel earlier was mentioning, when you like, if you just kind of like make a community that's bigger that just includes the two other communities with nothing else, then it's almost just erasing all the differences. And then you're not really doing anything, you're not meeting anything, you're just kind of moving to a higher level and ignoring what was down below. And it reminds me to kind of connect to the way that Gabriel divided kind of the logic of nationalism and populism, how there's like the nationalism, right, tries to erase this like boundary operation of negotiating between inside and outside, whereas populism does the opposite, right? There is no inside, there is no outside. There's kind of everything, but it's always just this sort of negotiation aspect. And maybe unfortunately to bring Benji's own way of thinking about this again, that fits very well with the whole, like, on the one side, I can explain this in a way that hopefully makes sense, like what he calls the ontotheological on the side of nationalism and whatever, like democratic materialist on the side of populism, right? Where nationalism is more about like one unified signifier that can like tell the difference in a sort of classical way, in or out. So it's, as you said, just like a replacement of like the old religious framework of like just do like the you know, the father, just do the thing, don't question it. Whereas populism is in the way that it always goes back to the people. It's trying to be this sort of like radically democratic, but in a way that, as I mentioned before, that like all internal differences sort of mush together a little bit, and then it's just kind of this like soup. And Badiou calls this orientation, right, democratic materialism, which is like sort of postmodern, like linguistic, everything is relativism, right? It's a very kind of like vague concept, so something like that. So I think there's some interesting connections there, and from that perspective, kind of maybe, I mean, this is not a concrete answer, but like a theoretical one, of like the answer to the question, or maybe a partial one, of like, how do you pass through without passing through? Nation is something like going back to bringing like the full logic of community, but the important thing is at the scale of things like nations and things like the whole world, if we're going to fight something like the climate crisis in a real way. Like you really need, like we can imagine a community that's very small, that has an inside and outside, and then a sort of way to negotiate that inside outsideness in a way that we could call whatever good or like well structured. But then it's a question of building it up at scales, and like how, I don't know, this kind of just like vague thoughts to connect everything together people have been saying. I don't know what you think.
Just one little thing. I think this problem is in Karatani too, when I think he tried to use associationism, like a way to that in that direction, but I think it has some problems with that scale thing too. And well, that's a huge gift giving strategy from nations giving up of guns and whatever. It's interesting, but I think it's really it's for me. It's sometimes like imaginary solution because it's really distant to see that happening, and I don't like that Kantian solution that he comes up with. So I like the association. God, that is it's very hard to me to say that word. Association, it's solution. It has really interesting points, but I think when you try to connect these things, this kinds of problems arise again, because different associations in different countries and with different economies, different levels of development, it's gonna make things hard to do. And that's the thing that I'm trying to think how we got something from this logic, because when you got this this moment when the modern state arises, they're dealing with this question too in a sort of way, and now we have established that we have all the system, and so when it arises in another level, in the level of organization. I think really we have sometimes that's what I find I used to think like religious organizations. We can I think look at that like a structure that reminds the model that leads to a nation, but you don't go that far because it's really hard. You don't just create new nations today. That fantasy from that guy's Rafael from Peter Thiel, that's guys, accelerationist guys from, that the patchwork theory. That's kind of crazy. You won't create a new state from in an oil platform. That's crazy. And but you have this logic operating. That's my question. I think why what do you have to what this nation's nation logic can teach us about how to organize in a complex environment. I don't know.
Yeah, just for one last thing, it seems to me that this, like, when we look at, I guess, like the fallbacks of the logic of nation and the logic of populism, both, they show two like pitfalls of what happens when you try to bring a community to the scale, to like a large scale, right? It's maybe things to watch out for. Maybe there's a way in which they're maybe both inevitable. I don't know, but who knows? Go ahead, John, right?
Yeah, so I'm glad I waited because actually I really liked that distinction, Yasha, between kind of the ontotheological and democratic materialism and all this. Partially because, like, just historically speaking, like a real turning point in the politics and discourse of nationalism away from the left was the Iranian Revolution, its co-optation by militant Shia fundamentalism. And it, like, the Iranian state's capacity to maintain a very militant, on the ground, anti-imperialist discourse that's like active through Hezbollah and other agents and whatnot. Like it like Raphael said, it really muddies the waters, precisely because, and I think this is what's like, I think we have to be able to distinguish, like, it's very important, I think, on one level, the distinction of kind of the binarization of 0 and 1 for nation and the kind of dual border of populism on one level. But I also think that we have to account empirically for the actual communities that do follow a full communitarian logic that are embedded in like nationalist discourse, right? Like, and I think that's like a very different example depending on where you go in the world. Like looking at fundamentalist Islamic traditions, they are linking together a lot of very deeply tied, connected, often like rural, but also often highly urbanized communities that very much have a very complicated mode A logic at play. I think when you look at, for example, the Trump movement in the United States, it's much a purer form of what Gabriel was saying of like substituting an imaginary relationship for real community ties. But I don't think that's the case if you look at fundamentalist Islamic movements, if you look at Hamas, if you look at Hezbollah, like they do have a much more sophisticated back and forth between real communitarian relations that have the full sophistication of mode A and this problematic splitting between populism and nation. And, you know, like Hamas is a great example of how those kind of dynamically move back and forth, where you've got very real Palestinian communities that use Islamic religious forms as their means of mediating mode A. But there's very real tensions between that and the actual like institutional framework of Hamas, which does fall much more into this kind of like split between nation and populist logic. And so I think we need to be able to account for that and show, I think maybe to a certain degree, how these things change depending on where we are in the world. Because again, like I think a country, a settler colonial country built on like a very successful genocide campaign like the United States does have a lot less in-depth community relations historically than nations in the Middle East, which have, you know, millennia of tradition that are still extant today, that weren't kind of like a product of devastation. But yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of like ways to zoom into that, but I'm curious like what people think. I know Gabriel's coming up afterwards as well as Michael, like what that kind of feedback looks like. I think the other main question I have coming from my particular place, the Pacific Northwest, where there's a very like both leftists and right wingers have like a lot of separatist fantasies up here, which are pretty absurd. But like I've organized a lot with folks at different points, and really like at this point, like to my mind, like separatist fantasies in the United States are one of those things kind of like the Soviet Union, which could appear impossible right up to the point where they actually become very, very feasible, I think, in the United States. And they're almost certainly going to go to the benefit of the right wing. So that in turn makes me wonder like what exactly it means to like, especially with the US being the kind of country it is as an imperialist nation, what that means for the left to relate to something like American identity in terms of potential right-wing separatism, in terms of like combating kind of more localized nationalities, which are almost, at least in my part of the US, like not going to be good things. So there's like the question of passing through nationalities, but I also think there's the question of what it means to just maintain relations with like existing nationalities, you know, and you know, you see similar things in France right now in the relationship between what it means to defend the Republic against Le Pen and whatnot. And the left is kind of in a weird place, like discursively trying to deal with that. It sounds similar to Brazil. So I'm curious kind of what that looks like. I don't know if there's separatist kind of stuff in Brazil in the same way, but like what that kind of like distinction might look like or whatnot. So yeah, I'll just leave it those kind of open questions.
Gabriel?
Yeah, Michael, just wanted to ask you one question, just a bibliography issue. That quote from Hobsbawm was from The Age of Revolutions, right? When he's talking about, or The Age of Capital. You're muted.
It's from Nations and Nationalism, but
okay.
I think it's yeah, it's really specific. But he recuperates and he talks a lot about what he discussed in the Age of Revolutions. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason why I ask,
the
first reason why I ask is because there is a really good chapter in Age of Capital called Building Nations. It's chapter 5.
Great. Gonna look for it.
the reason why I'm mentioning it is because Thiago and I ended up like we didn't plan to do this. Just one second.
Conseguindo se ouvir? Ah, foi mal. Achei que eu tava no fone.
Não sei, mas dá para me ouvir.
Tá.
Luis, this is the other room watching, and I can hear him through her microphone. No, I was just gonna say that another thing that I think is of interest is that when Thiago and I were trying to do this thing with, okay, let's use Viveiros de Castro and Lévi-Strauss and try to account for the logic of community and reciprocity from zero all the way to modernity. Like reading together with these anthropologists who have all these theories about, you know, the form of what's called the cosmology, right, of modern people, which is called the naturalist cosmology. Like we would all believe that there is one nature, but many cultures, right? The basis of multiculturalism would be this basic idea. There is one nature and many cultures. What we realized is that if you try to make the actual calculation, like to see if you can stitch together a world that has that structure, it doesn't work. Because if you have many cultures, as many cultures as there are people, ultimately, right? Like an individual, the logic of human reproduction, the logic of family building, the logic of social reproduction of people, it doesn't fit because you are the same family as your parents and their parents and their parents, but the naturalism of one nature, many cultures, also says that you're different from them. So you need to be different and the same. So it doesn't work. So what we realized is that if you want to find the community building in modernity, you need to look for what happens with people outside of family. So once you've been educated, turned into a worker that sells their labor force, who is a citizen, the community of citizens who sell their labor force, that forms a community that has the naturalist approach. But people, insofar as they're part of their families, parts of their kin, that doesn't form a world. That's contradictory. That kind of explains why psychoanalysis exists. Everyone comes to psychoanalysis saying, I cannot accept that part of my family, pretty much. Like you don't have a way of explaining that to yourself that makes sense. But it also shows that there is a good reason why we anthropomorphize economic institutions, right? They're the ones that we have animistic relations to, like the market says something, the country did this or that. But we cannot do that with our own human populations. Human populations don't become anthropomorphized. They become objectified. And market institutions that are part of that particular logic, they get to be persons, right? So you can actually account for that. But it's interesting because in this chapter by Hobsbawm, he says exactly this. He says, like, if you want to understand the formation of nations, you need to understand first how the state has a lot of, let's say, it creates the military apparatus to do things to the outside. But for a long time, it didn't need to do anything with it. It was just standing there. So you can use military practices to educate your own populace, to create an army, like the reserve army. At the same time, you need to prepare these people to be workers. And the nation is the form of community that will fit those two tasks, preparing an internal group to fight external battles and preparing an internal group to be separated from their families, right? So I like very much that he shows like a nation is a type of community for communityless people, right? Like it's meant to erase kinship. It's meant to erase like family relations, things like this, and leave only individuals, and then you group them together, right? So I find that it's a nice twist also, that you can actually explain nations in that context, that it's not just people build communities, and one of those types of communities is nations. Like when nations get to define, for example, who marries whom, it's very weird. It's like very uncommon, in fact. Like communities can do that, right? Other types of communities, like religious communities, ethnic groups, those groups, they have like claims to human kinship, but nations don't, right? Not directly. So it's nice to, I think it's also nice to take that into account, like to first take the idea that in modernity, there isn't a people, right? There isn't an obvious human group that is consistent, stable, and so on. And on top of that, the logic of the nation is like a reaction to this, like trying to make this lack of community compatible with state and capital, right? So I think it fits nicely together. And I just remember this because this chapter by Hobsbawm is very much about that, like looking how like 1848 is still a bit messy, like the way Napoleon becomes emperor. But if you look at what happens afterwards in Europe, like a lot of nation states are being formed very quickly, right? You see the pressure of state and capital to create an internal coherence based on state and capital, right? So it also makes nation less of this free-flowing, free-form community and more like the very restricted solving of a problem, right? Yeah, I just wanted to say.
Yeah, he discussed that in this book too. He gives much importance to this function of state in organizing this mess. I think things got messed up when we bring democracy in the equation, I think, because that's the point. When you get democracy, you can address this. I sent this little thing he said that's about when you get these people that have no place in state, they can't find a place in state, you how can I say, you take nationalism as a way to find your place. You're basically trying to change all the structure and find a place for you that it is not clearly situated, or when you're not a worker, you're not clearly a worker. And this is pointed when it's not clear your function, you're not a worker and you're not a capitalist. So you try to you have to change the organization of the nation, the state, to find a place, and you can do it sometimes, or can try to do it with nationalism. So I think this is interesting. He also did this do this thing that is to differentiate nationalism from patriotism. That patriotism is attached to state, and there is this idea of citizenship, and so this ethnical difference are erased by the state, and everybody is under some the state order. And nation is a secondary question. Nation is citizenship. He differentiates this nation attached to state from this nationalistic the discourse that emerges there. That is really linked to the democratic dimension, because when you have this idea of popular sovereignty, you have, if you make up a people, you can convince people that they are a people. You got power, you got election. That's what leads the state to deal with nationalism, to try to use this sentiment, this thing, this discourses to sustain of state, because you need to legitimate the state when you have democratic politics. And I think populism is totally dependent on this framework, democratic framework. That's why they call it radical democracy. So just to complicate stuff, muddle things, muddle waters.
I wasn't here for the presentation, so I'm really sorry if this was already covered. Just ignore me if it was. Well, my question had to do with the economic dimension of nationalism, which is, I think, kind of related to the question of boundaries that Gabriel was saying earlier. Which I think, like, there are things that no one really owns in the beginning, right? Like land, certain resources, and even when you work together, right? It's hard to determine who owns the product of a joint work effort, right? So if we, and I think this is closely related to the scaling problem, because with communities, it's very clear, if I give you a gift, it was mine and now it's yours. There's kind of a clear ownership there, and using that, you can glue together communities. But then when you start to grow, there become, like, you encounter, of course, things that nobody owns, like a lake, your local, the trees in the forest, right? The lumber. This type of stuff seems to correlate with the boundary problem. Who owns this, and I think the state is like one solution to that, right? The state says, okay, anything that's not really owned by anyone is kind of state property. Capitalism does something similar, right? A company owns surplus when it is produced in excess of the contractual obligated wages, right? So you kind of have this joining of workers, and then this dissolving of boundaries, and the surplus produced from that gets extracted also. So I guess my question is, what is the role of surplus in terms of, like, property, and how does that relate to this imaginary dimension of nationalism?
Yeah, let me. What I think today is, and I'm gonna use the Hobsbawm to talk about that too. I think that one messes up things, because you have this. I think what we're dealing with today is that we have powerless states when we talk about dealing with economy. So I think that's a problem, because and that's what makes this circular movement, because you can take state power, but you can change effectively your situation, because your situation it has systemic implications. You're not dealing with you're not sovereign, economic sovereign. So and I think at the end of the book, Hobsbawm talks about that. He thinks this nation question will how can I say, will slow down, will lose importance today. But so he died. So, and he's not seeing the Ukrainian war and what's happening in Hungary, for example. So I think the problem, the materiality, to just to say like that, of capital is what make things hard to think, because you have many eruptions of nationalism today, but does it change effectively the reality of that country? If you taking this situation, how it does affect Ukraine, for example, today, that did all this stuff. There is a materiality of war that is going to change stuff, but I really have my doubts about, if, for example, if Brazil takes up this thing, okay, Brazil above all, that the slogan of Bolsonaro, what you gonna do? You gonna stop dealing with China? They like Trump in the USA. They always talking about China, but it depends on China. So gift cycles that topic. So Gabriel, what? I'm gonna read what you.
No, I was just
wrote
gonna.
here,
I was just
but
saying.
I think John has a question.
Yeah, no, John, go ahead. Go ahead.
Ah, okay.
You're muted.
Mute.
I said I'm down to hear this point be elaborated, and then I can jump in. That's you're ready to go, Gabriel.
Okay. No, I was just commenting on what Dennis said here in the chat, because if we take this idea we've been developing for reciprocity further, then you need to, it makes sense with gift giving that locally it already has a place for a common thing, right? So the logic of gift is not that I give something to you and now it's yours. It's precisely that if I give you a gift, it's still mine. Like if your grandmother gives you a gift and you throw it out, you're like, you hate your grandmother because it's with you, but it's still part of her. You can't do whatever you want. It's not your property, right? Gifts are weird things. That's why, like, when you move houses, they're like all these gifts you don't use, but you can't throw them out because, they're part of a relation. Like they're naming this common point between you and another person. So gift economy tends to have a way of naming these common things, right? Or creating some, but it's very unstable because when you exchange gifts with another, it's like a increasing cycle. I give you something, you need to give me something back. It's not like a equality thing. It's a bit of domination. Like you give gifts to nature because you want to dominate nature, not because you're friends with nature, right? It's not the same thing as equality. So I was just saying that on the one hand, I think that gift economy has a bit of a place for these common things like land, things that we share, but they're neither mine nor yours, right? But it's funny because there is a connection between gift economy and surplus value and like the collective excess of labor, because it does look like most of the instances we personify in modernity, like the market woke up and did this, right? Disney is releasing a new movie. Like Disney is not a person. Disney is a corporation. Why are you talking as if it's a person? All the things we tend to personify as if they're people. So a very animistic kind of relation. They tend to be the things that represent collective human labor. Like we don't talk about the weather so much as a person or nature as a person, but products of human labor that got out of hand of human labor, we tend to personify. So there is an interesting connection to surplus, the thing that Dennis was saying.
Yeah, just one more comment there is like, yeah, I think the gift thing is correct. It is the name for the common thing. It's just not, if there are things like the climate or water, clean water and so on, those are not gifts given by another community, but it's gifts given by nature, right, originally.
Yeah, but I mean, for most societies, that's not a problem. Like for gifts, like you can accept that nature is also part of the gift giving. I mean, I'm not trying to kind of say that this is a solution, because there is a limit to this, right? What about, I mean, the problem with large scale things is not so much the form of the other. Like, can I treat nature as an agent? That's not that difficult. Or can I treat, you know, the market as the other as an agent? That's easy. The hard thing is to treat a collection of humans as an agent. I think like you can do that if you remain yourself as a person, but can you depersonify yourself and treat like the party as a collective? That's harder, you know, like you're part of the bargain. To upscale it, I think that's really the challenge, like to upscale the other and treat it as a person that you're exchanging gifts with. I think it's easier, but to do that with yourself, like let's say a nation decides to give up an army. That's like Karatani's example of gifts, right? Modern gifts, like Japan giving up having an army. Will the people in the country feel like they gave a gift? Or will they feel like some representative decided this and they went along, right? Will it be transitive that everyone feels like they're part of this object which entered into a gift economy with another?
Yeah,
Whereas,
I would say, I mean, this is almost
receiving a gift from France is easy, like, right? But giving a gift to France is not that easy.
yeah. I think the question of populism is closely related to this, because I think like when you have populism, you're almost like appealing to the fact that this was like what we have is a gift from all of us, so we should somehow like have some say in it. It's like a moment of recognition that the gift is that something in the surplus is actually a gift from the people, right? But I also want to make one last comment, which is that, yeah, I think here Ostrom has a important place we should study, because she outlines a type of ownership that is neither state nor market, which is, I think, what you're talking about, like an upscaling of people themselves as a form of ownership, collective ownership.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to reduce collective ownership to reciprocity. I really don't think that to match up, but yeah, so I agree, it's something else.
Before I go, I just want to see if Michael had any responses to it. You're muted, Michael.
I couldn't listen what you say.
Oh, I was just saying, before I went into my stuff, I just want to see if you had any responses to Dennis and Gabriel's points.
Okay. How do I respond?
Yeah, I was just wondering if like you had responses.
If you wanted to comment.
No.
Okay.
I don't know. I have nothing to comment. I have to take a pee now. I lost the most part of it.
Cool. I'll jump in then. So yeah, so I just kind of want to riff off a Hobsbawm for a second, because this is something I'm still like working on. So, you know, in the spirit of like ongoing research, but and as part of my larger critique of the classic notion of imperialism, which really kind of sees all the dynamics kind of emerging between the French Revolution and World War I, basically. And I'm just not nearly so convinced as I once was, especially if you look at the particularities of, like, you know, Lenin lists like 6 characteristics of imperialism in his famous essay. And of those 6, the only one that's truly new in the late 1800s is that the whole earth is covered by the capitalist system, which I think actually in the analysis is what's underestimated, is the effect of that total coverage, which we can now kind of talk about with Topos theory and topology and stuff. But most of the internal dynamics of the nation's finance capital, the problems of markets, they're already at play, even with Spain, even like arguably in a smaller scale prior to the 100 Years' War and everything with world, there's just I think a more subtle thing there. But one of my main critiques specifically of the question of nationalism and nations is and I know this is a whole contentious debate, but you know, the emergence of French nationalism, which is probably of anyone the paradigm of nationalism around the world, is like, you can go back to the 100 Years' War, the invasion of the English in Southwest France, and the fact that it doesn't fall under really either nationalism or patriotism in Hobsbawm, because on the one hand, you don't have this like the conditions that Gabriel just nicely summed up from the 1800s weren't really in play. You had capitalist formations beginning to develop. You can certainly see the pieces there, which I think are interesting, but you don't see the kind of saturation of the world. And at the same time, when peasant nationalism began to emerge, in large part was a response to their own aristocratic class like preying on them. So you can't really call it patriotism. They were calling on the king to like put their own people in place, but they weren't necessarily like doing it out of pure loyalty to the king. Like you see a lot of an attempt to defend the really existing communities in the form of this aggregate thing called a nation, called the French people, that I think is more problematic than this kind of top-down depiction that I feel like Hobsbawm ultimately goes with. That like it's a very, like, not that it's not responding to real things that are kind of like molecular processes, but that it's ultimately kind of a stage managed process that comes out of, you know, which when you look at Bonapartism as your model, yeah, that's exactly what happens. But I think the problem is that like that in many ways can be an exception, right? Like if you look at a text that comes along about what 200-300 years earlier, like Machiavelli's The Prince, you have a very explicit national unification program there. One which is definitely, like, Italy at the time had both the like collapsing of kinship networks going on within cities and was totally in need of some kind of unificational army to, like, both of those dynamics were there. But the advocation of nationalism was something that was being like brought up by people against like the things that Hobsbawm gives agency to nationalism, which are like the state and whatnot. And I'm not well, the other thing that like parallels this is Silvio Federici's critique of like Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, the role of like gender laws that were imposed, the very real, like, and this is where I think, like, on the one hand, we can totally say, yes, the like state takes over reproductive relationships in a very real way through the witch trials and the codification of heteronormative relationships and the invisibilization of domestic labor, blah, blah, blah. But I think like you can't separate the emergence of nationalism from that process. And that's why like I'm hesitant to just kind of see it as merely a response to the absence of something, because there's always something positive that's being defended in nationalism, and it's not like a positive lack. And I don't really know it. I don't know. There's just something. You like in I think part of like the why do we keep getting stuck there? It's because there's always something at stake. That this is like the cheapest solution to defend what matters. And I think like one of the best questions is like for example, like the role of mothers in like right-wing populist movements, right? I think that's a very good intersectional place to kind of ask these questions of like where social reproduction and nationalism tie, because what's being defended a lot of times aren't a lack of something, it's the very real, however meager, social connections or community connections that are like extant. I don't know, so I feel like I'm asking the same thing again in a different way, but I don't know, there's just something there, so I'll just stop. It just keeps going nowhere.
And I totally understand because I'm on the same page. Gabriel wrote an essay in the chat.
I'm sorry. I was just saying that I think that because John asked about fundamentalism, and I think that, I mean, a lot of writers point that fundamentalism is a modern phenomena, right? And it's actually usually a phenomena that happens after like modernization processes are interrupted. It's not like it's not a sign of anything backwards. It's actually a sign of something looking very much forward, right? Almost like a too quick jump forward. And I think it's nice to look at it again as like a miniature version of the nation. Like it's almost like a small group of people mimics a nation, you know, because again, it's all about individual faith. Like fundamentalist groups, they don't pass along traits. So if you're the son of a fundamentalist, you're not fundamentalist. You need to become one still, right? Unlike like for most religions where you're at least born into that religion, if you want to opt out, you need to do something about it, right? So it looks like a miniature version of a nation, you know. It doesn't look like just a type of community. So it's no wonder that there's sometimes a tension between fundamentalist groups which are trying to keep a community alive in this kind of in and out way, right? With basing itself like on, you know, clear readings of texts, for example. In and out, there's a direct right reading or the wrong reading, like very clear protocols, very clear purging of ambivalent elements and so on. Whereas community building, I think that what, my opinion, seems to be the principal characteristics of communities is that most communities have the means to do something about ambivalence. You know, like you have the people who are inside, the people who are outside, and then you have like stuff you do to strangers to help out or to keep them away, or methods for dealing with something you don't really know where to place it. You know, they don't need to be good methods. I'm not saying they're good. I'm just saying that there are some usually, right? So exactly. So like Christian fundamentalism is quite distinct from just Christian community building, right? Which again, doesn't need to be a good thing. Like you can have Christian communities that require creating some level of animosity through some other community, but you know, like there is some distinction. So for example, if you cheer for a soccer team, you don't like to create animosity with an imaginary adversary. You want to have animosity to have an enemy who is an actual other team, which you respect, and you want to see them make the next move so you can make your move and you can then say something and so on, right? You don't want to create a invisible threat. You want to create a real threat so you can actually play a game, right? So groups that create imaginary threats, they don't enter into the reciprocity game, right? It's like a truncated, interrupted reciprocity. Like you don't want the enemy to play a part in the game. But community building usually is all about like having, it can be deadly, but still it's like a weirdly honorable interaction with an enemy, right? So it can lead to destruction. It can lead like to destruction. But I think also this is a very special characteristics of wars in the nation state era, that they quickly became wars against enemies who are not seen as equal, right? It's not like warriors versus warriors. It's warriors versus civilians who cannot fight back. So it's not really war so much as two acts of violence committed at the same time, just not the same, right? So I think all these things are good to distinguish like the good and the bad side of community building, which can lead to war, destruction, gruesome violence, and all those things as well. But it's different from this weird truncated version of imagined communities, which is like a pathologized community, right? And fundamentalism is funny like that, right? It has a hard time creating concrete enemies. That's also why it cannot honor the enemy. Like you cannot treat like, for example, Christian communities, they are against the devil, but you've never seen anyone respect the devil so much as a Christian. Like it's constantly negotiating with sins. Everyone is a sinner. So that's community. Like you don't mean the inside and the outside, Christians and non-Christians. You have Christians, non-Christians, but every Christian is partially a non-Christian because you also sin, right? Most religions and most communities have some mechanism to like give a name to the enemy, but that's an honorable kind of duality that you need to respect, and it actually makes the whole thing exciting, right? Whereas like nations, you don't know what the other is, and fundamentalism also, like it loses that kind of, you know, it's outside, but I might be more like the other than I wanted to be, so I need to be careful and things like that. Like they disappear, right? Like that's an interesting fact also for something Michael and I and Rafael and other people, we were talking about a long time ago about like this new Black cinema in the States, like Jordan Peele, Atlanta. Like it's very interesting that they moved away from a certain social realist representation of racism in the States into a very abstract, more kind of vibes representation of racism, you know. But at the same time, it's a aesthetics that is created by a lot of mixed race people. So it's like whiteness is not something that is just outside. It's also partially inside, and you're kind of not sure where you are with it, and creates funny situations, you know. So it's interesting. Like it's more like community building, perhaps, than other forms of you know, mapping out racial questions, because it has a very sophisticated way of naming, being internally kind of. Oh yeah, Michael went away.
Oh, there you go. You're back.
Michael, are you in the situ?
Yeah, I am.
Michael is in the middle of the woods.
So I lose you. You were saying something what I think is interesting, and I dropped.
I was just talking about like new American Black cinema, and how it's really done by a lot of people with like who take very seriously mixed race impasses, right? And how it seems to be very important to like building a certain vocabulary for, it has that also the same thing, like there's the inside, the outside, and that thing which is neither here nor there, right? And like adding the neither here nor there of Blackness in the States seems to be very much what all these movies are doing, right? You think you're amongst Black people, but not really. You think you're amongst white people, but not really. You don't really know where you are. Like, and I feel like it has a lot to do with that, like trying to add this indeterminate boundary thing back to community, you know?
É o problema do Afrobege. Desculpa, não tem como traduzir.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very particular Portuguese, Afro-beige.
So, well, guys, I think if you wanna end it up here, for me that's okay. But it was really better than I think it would be because I really I've been struggle with this today because I was reading this fucking book that I think it would help, but I think if I had focused on the presentation, it would be better. But that's okay. I think I got some really good insights here, and it was good to break the ice because maybe sometime I can make another presentation with something more organized when the research was more advanced too. So thank you very much.
This is really
everybody.
good. Thank
It
you.
was great
Yeah, it
for
was
me.
really cool, man.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Could you,
fantastic.
if you haven't already, could you send the slides in the WhatsApp or?
Oh
something?
yeah.
So I can look at them. Thank you.
I'll make a PDF and send you.
Really great, guys. So I think Rafael is the one who needs
Great.
to close the meeting.
Okay, well,
And he's clearly
Bye,
not
guys.
see
in
us
front of
gone.
his
So
Here we
okay,
go.
bye. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
See you
Michael.
guys. Bye-bye.